welcome to the Dibley Diaries for this week. This week we're thinking about all sorts of different things from the Matthew 10 passage that we're having later on, but I wanted to start in a rural challenge by thinking about who is the most important person in a village. Who is the most important person in the village? Is it going to be the person with the biggest house? Is it the person who is the richest person in the village? Who is the person who holds the most power in a village? Or is it the person who has lived in the village the longest, who knows everybody, knows everything that happens in the village? Who is the most important person in a village? This can be a real challenge for village dynamics, for a village community, because someone who holds a lot of power and respect in that way can use it how they want, either for good, for ill, for ruthlessly pursuing their own agenda, or for encouraging others in growth and all sorts of things. So the power sits with people, the prime person, the mover and shaker in the village, whoever that is. They become the most important person. And that's difficult, especially in the church community in a village. If the person who is the most powerful influencer in the village is a church person, that can work for good, but also it can be very difficult dynamic for people to manage, especially if it's perceived that change might be a good thing if this person didn't want change. So who is the most important person in your village, and how does that affect your village dynamic for good or for not such good things going on in your village? Thought for the week this week is based on the gospel passage for the week, which is Matthew 10, 24 to 36, and it's a really interesting passage. In the beginning of the passage, Jesus talks about how the disciples are going to have a hard time, that people are going to insult them and misunderstand them and possibly even persecute them, and he says, well, if they're going to insult me, then how much more are they going to insult you as my followers and misunderstand you? So Jesus starts that with a kind of warning that it's going to be difficult. People are not going to understand them. So Jesus says that at the very beginning of the passage. Then at the end of the passage, Jesus talks about how families are going to be in strife and there's going to be conflict within families. Jesus talks about that, how things are going to be really difficult there, and he kind of explains that, and that shouldn't really be a surprise to people from brought up in the Jewish tradition, because the story of the first family, then the first farmer, the first son, Cain, kills the nomadic shepherd Abel. So there's already blood conflict in the very first family in the tradition of the Jewish people, trying to understand what it means to be human. As a little archaeological aside, I do find in the UK it's really interesting to see that there is a lot of bloodshed in the archaeological evidence as people begin to farm versus people hunter-gatherer. So it is that actually that caused a huge and violent conflict between people who thought that they had the right to roam the land and other people who wanted to farm. So Jesus was saying there's going to be all this sort of trouble, and that is going to be a real problem for you. But then in the middle of the passage, there's a little bit which is all about how much God cares for each one of us and how God loves each of us. And it talks about sparrows, and it talks about how insignificant they are, how they're sold for very, very little money. And then Jesus says this remarkable thing. He says, even the hairs on your head are numbered. So you are worth so much more than sparrows. Do not worry, because God cares for you. And that led to me thinking about my favourite ever Christian poem, and there are lots on the shortlist for that, but I actually first came across it in this book called A Touch of Flame, which is compiled by Jane Brockensbury, and I have to read it, so this is the book. I have to read this poem out because otherwise I get lost in the middle, but it's really short and it just goes like this. It's by Jane Brockensbury and it goes, Hair 543 29635 fell out today. God noticed. And I find that poem remarkable because it just rephrases that saying of Jesus in this gospel passage into a different way, a way that brings us up sharp, that makes us understand things. I mean, I think my children would think that they were loved as they were brought up, but I don't think, I certainly never knew if one hair fell out, certainly what number it was, I didn't know that. I mean, I would have noticed if one of them had taken scissors to the others and cut a great chunk out, but I didn't know which hairs were numbered which, and yet I would say that I love my children hugely, but God loves us more than that, and that is what Jesus is promising for each of his followers. No more one important person over another important person. No one who has status or knowledge or the big house being more important than the other person. For all of Jesus' followers, this is God's promise. This is how much God loves you, that he knows which number hair fell down the plug hole in the shower today. And that's a remarkable way of being loved. It's a remarkable way of being loved. And so that's what I wanted us to think about today. How does that affect us? How do we try to understand that? How do we try to think about that and to remember that? In England, where I live, it's been very hot the past few weeks and my hands have become very swollen. So I've not even been able to wear my wedding ring, which we present wedding rings as a token of love, as a way of understanding. You can think about the ring being eternal or unending, but it's a symbol of that love. How would we want to remember how God loves us? How would we want to remember how God loves us? The grandmother of a friend of mine used to have little bits of coloured tape stuck around her house, you know, on a light switch or on the switch for the kettle or different things around her house, so that she would remember that God loved her with this sort of amazing love and was with her all the time, everywhere she went, doing even all these mundane things like switching on a light or switching on the kettle. How would we have that in our lives? What would be a really good symbol for us to think about how much God loves each one of us? The Dibbly moment of the week this week is about symbols of love, the things that we've been talking about, and in particular to do with orders of service for marriages. So when people get married for their wedding, they have a printed order of service, and often they put really lovely symbols on it. Sometimes they have a picture of the church building, but they might have the two rings on it, they might have a dove on it, they might have hearts on it, they might have all sorts of symbols on it, and yet I can't get out of my mind the order of service that I had for a couple who had lobsters on the front of their order of service, and they weren't even lobsters, they were kind of langoustines, and I asked them about it and they were like, oh no, we just really like those sort of foodie things, so we're putting them on the order of service and on the invitation. And I was thinking, this is really weird. Now I've since found out that in Friends the lobster thing is a thing, but they never mentioned that to me. They never mentioned that kind of, you know, Friends the sitcom to me, and they were sort of the wrong age to have really been watching that, really. So I don't understand. I still to this day do not understand why they had langoustines on the front of their order of service for their wedding, but they did. So that's it for the Dibley Diaries for this week. I pray that you and your village, however large or small, or whatever your chosen symbols of love would be, have a really blessed week.